Hello.
Speak into the microphone.
Hello. Who's enjoying themselves so far? Hey! This panel is on cognitive biases, and you may already have seen Carol's piece earlier today. Who was there for that? So you know that Carol is a social psychologist and has done work on cognitive biases. We also have Professor Richard Wiseman, who we all know. Hands up if we know him. Hands up if we know him in relation to chicken-related activities.
Oh, for goodness sake. That's it, isn't it? It's on my gravestone, isn't it?
And we have Professor Chris French. I would like to start, I suppose, by asking each of them to just summarise, just a quick 5-minute summary of cognitive biases, why they even matter, why they're useful, why they apply to us. Carol, should we start with you?
Thought I had just spoken
yes, that's
about
right.
that. First, I just have to say a funny thing. The very first book I wrote was on anger. It was on the pseudoscience and psychobabble of anger. And one of the things I learned is almost nothing you can do that won't make somebody cross. One of the first talks I had to give was at a room like this, you know, with everybody spread out this way. And afterwards, people on one side of the room came up to me and said, "You didn't look at us enough." Snork. Anyway, so forgive us. Cognitive biases, you know, in the great interesting evolution of how we think about the human mind, I'm struck by the fact that this is another stab at human arrogance, isn't it? That there's kind of been a movement in the past 20 years or more to come up with more and more of the things we do that are irrational, rather that we're not the rational animal at all. We're, as my co-author Elliot puts it, the rationalizing animal. And I love that Richard Thaler has won the Nobel Prize in Economics for stealing from social psychology the idea of that in economics there is no rational man. Its behavior, economic behavior, is subject to biases of how we think and reason. And so it's interesting to me, I mean, that slide I showed this morning, which I only saw recently, I don't know how it projected, but it was just such a funny thing. It's, you know, 188 cognitive biases have been identified that show that we're just not processing like processors, are we? So, so I think there's two aspects of this. One is that while we are busy identifying why we don't think critically and rationally, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we can think critically and rationally and not get too despondent. It's very easy to, I think, because the direction of research is all about why we don't. The other thing is to keep in mind the, I don't like the reductionist impulse to claim that everything that we do and every way that we think must have had some evolutionary purpose to it, that everything is, you know, hardwired in the brain. But certainly we can see, if only in a, I mean, not that it's been confirmed exactly, but the bias to have a Wednesday proposition, for example, I choose this, it works for me, therefore I'm staying with it and not rethinking it, would have had benefits for humanity. And so that these biases aren't irrational in terms of being maladaptive. They're actually very adaptive and very functional in how we get through our everyday lives. If we had to stop and question every single thing we did, we wouldn't get to breakfast. Although I have to laugh because I used to say, you don't want to stop and think about whether you should brush your teeth, right? And then there was that study about why you don't have to floss. Anyway, so I think that would be the point, is to understand that our biases protect us, keep our self-esteem high, mostly keep us working for the survival of our group, those who are like us and share our beliefs. They give us an identity. They give us a feeling that we're not just marbles rattling around in an empty universe. They ground us. So there are many benefits of being irrational, if you will.
Very good, thank you. Well, I went to buy shirts the other day, and I went to the shirt shop, And it was the shirt I wanted was £40, which for anybody who knows the way I dress is quite an investment from my point of view. So I was going to buy this shirt to give a talk, and I thought I'll be wearing it tonight for the Ockhams. I don't get to it; it's only a blue shirt. There's nothing particularly fancy about it. But I thought I'd better buy two because I know what I'm like. I'll put it on and I'll put coffee down the front of it. So I'll get two shirts. And the man said, "Well, that's £80 for the two shirts." And he said, "We've got a deal on. If you buy two shirts for £80, then you can get three shirts for £90. And I thought that was a bargain because it's only £10 for the extra shirt. So I said, "I'll have three shirts for £90. And he said, "Well, it's strange you've done that because for £100 you can get four shirts. It's a very special deal that we've got on." So I spent £100 and walked out with four identical shirts. So I'm very interested in cognitive biases because they seem to be remarkably effective some of the time. So I only have the one shirt with me that's this evening, and so when you see it, no backup. I am flying without a backup on this. I know, crazy. It shows the lack of respect I have for the audience. But so basically, when you see the blue shirt tonight, know that I've essentially spent £100 when I only intend to spend 40. So I'm interested in cognitive biases, particularly how they affect me, actually, in my everyday life. But when I was listening to Carol's very good talk, I was thinking that one of the main drivers behind this is our wish and our need to think of ourselves as good people. That actually we need to think, "Oh, I'm doing the right thing, and I'm a good person." And I just think, well, if that's the fundamental problem, then just kind of get over yourself. Just realise that a lot of the time you're a bad person. And that's okay. That's all right. We all are. We're all bad people some of the time. You lot in particular, not so much me. But so I'm interested in exploring both their use in everyday life, particularly shirt shops, where they seem to be prevalent, and also just the degree to which we can sort of set aside all of that and go, you know what, some of the time we're not perhaps as wonderful as we hoped we were.
Except for you.
Except for me, that's right.
It's actually, Richard is a very, very bad person.
I'm very bad.
Know,
I am a very bad person, yes. I beat the shirt man to death with his... Because I got enough shirt, I got enough oomph behind the shirts to do it.
Just picking up on one of the points that Carol made about the kind of evolutionary perspective on these things, I think it's kind of quite interesting because, as some of you might know, I'm particularly interested in the psychology of paranormal beliefs and the role that cognitive biases might play in leading people to believe that something's happened to them and the only explanation is a paranormal one. Well, one of the questions that it kind of raises, the whole area of cognitive biases, is why do we still have them? If evolution shouldn't it have worked in such a way that those biases have disappeared? Isn't it always better to be in touch with the way things really are rather than sometimes have these biases that are affecting the way that we interpret what's happening around us? And the kind of standard argument to explain that would be an evolutionary one, that in terms of our evolution, particularly if you think in terms of kind of Kahneman type ideas about system 1 and system 2 thinking. We've got two different modes of thought. System 1 is typically characterized as being kind of fast, it's automatic, it's effortless, very loosely speaking, it's intuition. System 2 is slower, it's sequential, it's effortful, what we typically might attach the label reasoning to. So we're all capable, in fact we're all always using these two modes of thought. But the evidence suggests we're much more influenced by System 1 thinking than we might care to acknowledge. And what we're very good at is justifying our attitudes and beliefs that may have arisen from System 1 thinking via System 2. So it again gets back to this point about us being the rationalising animal. But why have we got those biases in the first place? Well, from an evolutionary perspective, if you've got those two possible ways of interacting with the world around you, there's a kind of cost-benefit analysis to do. And people always give the same example, so I will give the same example. As a Stone Age man standing there and there's something rustling in the bushes. And in one situation, there's a kind of System 1 response that assumes it's a saber-toothed tiger and gets the hell out of there. The other possibility is kind of system 2 thinking, where you stand there scratching your beard thinking, I wonder if that really is a saber-toothed tiger or not. Now, that's not a very good strategy in terms of passing on your genes to the next generation. It's better to have a quick system that will sometimes make mistakes, but they won't be very costly mistakes, rather than a slower system that just by its very slowness might lead you into difficulties. But, you know, basically, it's better to have a system that assumes there is something there rather than there isn't something there. And similar kinds of biases that seem to be related to paranormal belief, like the intentionality bias. We seem to have an implicit bias that when things happen, it's because someone or something made them happen. Now, according to the developmental psychologists, we're able to, as we develop, we override that. But our default assumption, our initial assumption is someone or something made that happen. Now, again, in terms of a world where it might be difficult to survive, it's better to make that assumption. It might be something that's a threat. And our brains have evolved not to help us kind of ascertain the truth with a capital T. It's to keep us alive. And so in that types of evolutionary cost-benefit analysis, you can see where a lot of these biases have come from. And one of the things that interests me, I mean, I'm interested in not only paranormal belief, but also other examples of what I would see as, broadly speaking, magical thinking. So religious beliefs, belief in conspiracy theories, general superstitions. A lot of the biases seem to be quite common across those different forms of magical thinking. There are some differences, but again, that's an interesting aspect to the whole thing. So I don't think there's been enough research kind of directly looking at how this relates to shirt shops. I would support further research in that area, definitely.
I think so.
But yeah, it's
it may be the rustling in the bushes, to use that analogy. It was a salesperson with like some animal skins. They go, you can have this for 4 rocks, you can have one of these.
And Richard would have fallen for it.
Oh, every time, yes.
But you said something really interesting here, which is that the overall mechanism driving this is the need for an explanation. Whatever the explanation is, we're all searching for explanations. We don't just want to know who done it, but why they done it. Yeah. I mean, in America, the horrible Las Vegas massacre, everybody is going insane because no one can figure out why this guy went and killed 58 people and so on. And so that's the first thing, that humans evolved to want to know why, to have an explanation. And of course, then we understand that the consequences of the explanations we make will vary significantly if you think it's a demon infecting you or a germ or your friend, you know, I mean, right? So, yeah.
And I noticed you pointed out in your talk, Carol, that the motivated reasoning, you know, but it's basically when you have a high emotional stake, it's harder to change your mind.
Indeed.
And it's not necessarily... what I thought was it wasn't necessarily so much even your own belief in yourself, but how you're expected to behave in a group. So,
can you use the microphone, please?
okay, how you're expected.
Oh, there. Oh, there's the microphone.
Oh, there we go.
Oh.
So
you have to be right up on it.
For example, in the last couple of decades, medicine has made a great deal of effort to change its culture so that the most junior person in the room has a say. Do you remember the Carry On films, perhaps the British films where you had Sir Lancelot Spratt was a surgeon and he was an absolute fascist and he wouldn't have survived in medicine at that time had he not been that. What do we do in situations where there is a huge cultural pressure from the rest of the group to look powerful and to not change your mind, such as politics? How can we apply the idea? Sorry, you had a Trump-related talk this morning.
I did.
Yes.
I brought it on myself. Well. Okay, well, you're elevating the problem of acknowledging mistakes and change in a culture, whether it's a corporate culture, a medical culture, a university culture, any cultural establishment where there are rules of the game. And then the question is how to change those rules, how to move things along. Well, so I've been saying for many years, 1 dissonant is a crazy person, 2 is a conspiracy, and 3 is a movement. What we know in social psychology is for change to occur, 1 person being critical and raising doubts or sorry, that's wrong, will be rejected by the group on behalf of group unity, and because that one person is throwing everybody into a state of dissonance. You mean we could be wrong? So you need in every group a critical number of people to become a force to reckon with. But the other really big issue is that notice in, for example, the case of the Central Park joggers, it was not the original prosecutors who were willing to correct the mistake they made. It never is the original not never, sometimes, but most of the time, the people who are responsible for the original mistake, whether it's medical or political, certainly political, or in any other area, are too busy covering their asses and defending themselves and justifying what they did. It almost always takes a higher level investigative unit to correct those mistakes and to change the institutional culture.
Years and years ago, and I used to sit in on meetings with people that came up with advertising campaigns. I used to love those meetings. I love ad people because they're really creative types. And this was way before, there's now a concept in business called the pre-mortem. And this was way before that. This guy was using it. And what he would do is say, right, what's our campaign? And they'd go, blah, 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 blah. Here's the campaign for whatever it was, shredded wheat or whatever it was, shirts. And which I was particularly interested in at the time. And
he's going to give each of us a shirt.
Oh, yes. I'm not. And then you go, right, fantastic, that's great. Let's imagine this campaign has absolutely tanked. It's the worst thing we've ever run. Tell me why that was the worst campaign we ever ran. Mm-hmm. This is before it's run. And people in the room would switch mindsets. And they'd go, that imagery is just awful. That slogan, it doesn't relate. Mm-hmm. And giving people permission to say why we've all made a terrible mistake. Now it's called a pre-mortem. It has a name.
It has a name.
It has a name.
I'm going to use this immediately.
Yes, so it's a great idea. Mm-hmm. Give yourself permission to think why something has been an absolute disaster, and give everyone in the group that permission to be critical, because otherwise you get all the social psychology of, I don't be the one that speaks up, I sound negative and cynical, I've been told that's a bad thing. So it was a great thing, because suddenly you saw a switch.
What could go wrong?
That's right. Well, imagine it has gone wrong, what went wrong, and suddenly this great campaign would fall apart in front of your eyes as somebody pointed out something absolutely obvious that no one had seen, because we're all trying to be so positive about it. So I think those sorts of things can make a difference in meetings and so on.
Yes, for groups, absolutely. Members of the groups have to know that they really do have the opportunity without punishment to say what the downside is. Eliot has a wonderful exercise that he offers too, which is when people recognize that they've done something wrong or if some mistake has happened, he says, think of this. What did you know at the time you made that decision that you didn't want to know?
Yes.
Isn't that terrific? That is so great. And then, well, I knew he was a drunken alcoholic bum. My sister kept telling me, but I said, no, I'll fix him.
Actually, it's a bit like, sorry, I'm so brief. Carnegie, I'm a huge fan of Dale Carnegie and How to Win Friends and Influence People. And that book was based on him spending about 10 years with a special little notebook, which was called Stupid Things That I've Done. And he just wrote down all the stupid things that he'd done and wished he hadn't done, all the stupid comments he made, the rude things, and the times he was a complete arsehole or whatever. He wrote them down, and the book springs from him looking at that. And saying, saying, what did I do wrong? Why did I behave like that? And so the great How to Win Friends, Influence People springs from that ability to go, what were my failings?
Well, also because we were speaking yesterday about this very thing, and you said one of the most important things is if you've really screwed up is to be able to say, I'm sorry, I've screwed up.
Which is that's one of the Carnegie
Dale
rules.
Carnegie
that's
things.
Right. Yes.
But there are some sort of whole cultures within our culture, like politics, where even though personally you might be prepared to do that, you won't succeed if you do.
Right. There was a very interesting presentation at the European Skeptics Congress by Mark Lynham, who had basically just done a complete about turn, having been an anti-GMO protester, realised he was convinced by the science that actually he was on the wrong side of the argument, and he did a complete about turn. And he had a clip from an interview he'd done on TV on the Hard Talk programme, where basically the interviewer was just totally laying into him for saying, why should we listen to you? You know, you said this and now you've changed your mind. Why should we have any faith in... And there is that whole attitude, and particularly in politics. I mean, for a politician to change their mind on anything, they know that they're actually... It's a flip-flop, yeah. They're gonna be crucified. And that's the attitude that's just actually wrong. You know, we should actually respect people who can actually say, well, I've thought about this more, I've looked at the evidence, and I've realised that what I previously thought isn't right. And yet people, it is still very difficult in certain contexts for that to happen. I mean, again, one of the points that Carol raised in her talk this morning, it's so easy to spread fake news. I mean, the last column I wrote for the Skeptic was about how easy it is just to retweet something because it fits with your preconceptions. You know, about something about Trump or something about Theresa May, and then you realise actually the claim is not based on anything. It's fake news. It's made up. And I feel so bad when I do that, and I see people retweeting it, and I'm thinking, no, don't. I was wrong. Please stop. You know, there's nothing you can do. It's out there. But
speed of response really mitigates against taking the time to check anything. And
when you're one of those sad people...
You can't say count to 10 anymore. You have to count to 3,211 or something.
And when you're one of those sad people like me that kind of looks at your phone first thing in the morning and you've not really switched your brain on properly, it is so easy to make those kinds of mistakes.
Yeah. I'm kind of interested in the way that cognitive biases serve us as well, because they're simply not, you know, just all bad. So I was wondering if each of the panel could come up with an example of how it really compromises us and also how it really helps us, sort of at different ends of the spectrum. Could you think of an example?
Oh, right. Well, cognitive dissonance reduction is what allows us to sleep at night after a decision. And everybody knows the experience of how bad it feels when you can't reduce dissonance. It's called buyer's remorse. Or people who, actually in the revision of our book, we have our last chapter includes more about the problem for people who cannot reduce dissonance and who beat themselves up endlessly over a long period of time, relentlessly flagellating themselves over mistakes or bad decisions or cruelties they imposed. We call this PTSD when soldiers return from war and cannot forgive themselves for atrocities they might have committed in wartime. That's, you know, if you can reduce dissonance, well, it was war and I was obligated and it was him or me, that's easier than when you cannot do that. So we can clearly see the benefit of being able to reduce dissonance by knowing what it feels like when we can't. And as Eliot puts it, I'm all in favor of our having good sleep, but sometimes some sleepless nights are called for if we really need to rethink something that we've done. I mean, he tells a wonderful, it's such a wonderful story of how he reduced, you know, he's the king of dissonance. I call him up and I say, Eliot, what does this mean? What should I do? When he had to make a choice, when he was at the University of Minnesota, and he had to choose a house to live with his wife and 4 children, and he wanted to live close to campus, but it wasn't a great area, and his wife wanted to live out in the countryside, which would have been better for the children, and there was a nice lake there, but it was far from campus, and he wanted to be close to campus, and they fussed about this decision, and they finally bought the house with the lake, near the lake. He said, and one January day, and you have to understand in Minnesota in January, it is very, very cold. You don't know what that cold feels like. And he saw an ad for a canoe on sale, because that's when you would sell your canoe. And he bought the canoe, and he drives home with the canoe on the top of his car. And his wife burst out laughing, and he said, "What's so funny?" And she said, "Ask Leon Festinger." He had bought a canoe to reduce the dissonance he felt about moving to this house in the countryside. He was going to be able to use the canoe on the lake in the summer, a benefit of having moved. So that's what it accomplishes for us. It allows us to feel better about the decisions that we make.
I don't know. So the only thought that comes to mind on that is someone told me once, and was never, if it matters, never just say sorry. That was the best advice I ever got. If it matters, so not if you bump into somebody and you say sorry, it doesn't really matter. If it matters, never just say sorry. And what that means is you say, I'm sorry I did that, and this is what I'm going to do about it.
Yes.
And that difference feels very different. As soon as you say, I'm really sorry I did that, and to make up for it, this is what I'm going to do. And my favourite one, my favourite version of it, is this is the money I'm going to give to charity for doing that thing, because I'm a bad person to make up for it. Now, sorry feels different.
Sorry feels different. And I just add one more thing to that. What people often do is they attach an excuse to the sorry.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry I didn't visit you in hospital when you were so ill and you really wanted me to come. But the reason is that I just hate hospitals and I hate sick people and I hate coming to, I was busy. Okay. No excuses. I should have been there for you when you were in hospital and I wasn't there and that was wrong. I'm sorry.
And I'm sorry. And what am I going to do? I'm sorry, so I'm going to give £500 to the charity, whatever. Now, when you write that cheque or transfer that money for £500, then you feel sorry.
But only for yourself.
But to that point, you're just kidding yourself. So when somebody says sorry to me, if they've done something properly wrong, I go, that's all fine, yeah, whatever. I don't really care how you feel about it. How much money are you going to give me or give to charity? And they go, what do you mean? I say, oh, come on, 200 quid. It's got to be worth 200 quid. And if they give me £200, you say it feels different, doesn't it? Now you're sorry you did it. The first time you're just doing it or just saying sorry for your own benefit. So never just say sorry, I think, is one of those things which kind of really gets you into that mindset of a way of just trying to stop the dissonance, which is all about yourself, and actually thinking about the harm you've actually done.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Chris?
I was thinking when you said there about people having to say sorry in situations where it really, really does matter. I mean, and one of the areas that I'm interested in is the area of false memories, particularly with respect to historic sexual abuse cases. And I mean, that's a kind of, in terms of a kind of cognitive dissonance example, it is very, very powerful, because you've got a situation here where someone has gone in for therapy with no memories of ever being the victim of childhood sexual abuse, and by the end of the therapy they're convinced that they were the victim. They've often got clear memories to back that up. And it's very, very, I mean, they then obviously families are torn apart. People may find themselves being investigated by the police, appearing in court, even going to prison. So it's very, very serious stuff. In some cases, unfortunately maybe not enough, the people who have the false memories actually realise that their memories are false. And these retractors, as they're called, I have just huge amounts of admiration for them. To be able to actually, having put your family through a nightmare like that, to be able to say, I'm sorry, I realise actually it didn't happen, is something that, you know, should be greatly respected. But you can clearly see how difficult that would be. If you're in a situation where you know, it's very similar to the kind of examples you were given of the doctors who wouldn't accept that they were responsible for the deaths of all those women. If you know you're responsible for causing so much pain to your loved ones, it's then very difficult to admit.
The greater
that
the
you were
harm,
wrong.
the harder the ability
Absolutely.
to face up to it.
Them saying sorry, to me, just feels like a really horrible Christian thing. It just feels like, you know what I mean? That kind of, it's all about you, isn't it? It's like if I was on the receiving end of that, I'd go, what do I care how you feel? How are you actually going to make amends? How are you actually going to be sorry? Because just saying sorry just feels to me so trivial under those circumstances.
Well, here's an example.
So have they? I'm sorry,
No,
Carol. Just finish that point. So have they ever done anything to make amends? And if they haven't, I believe that word sorry is for their own benefit, not for the benefit of the people they've harmed. It makes them even worse people.
Well,
I bet. And some of them are going to be Christians.
Well, but the people who But you're exactly right, because what you want is a behavioral commitment that really illustrates that you get it. You see, that you get it so that you won't repeat it. When patients are the victims of a doctor's mistake, an honest mistake, which can happen because doctors are human beings, although not everybody realizes this, but what patients want is, I want you to say I'm sorry that this happened to you, and we are going to make amends in the following ways. We're changing policies in the hospital. We're going to pay for the correcting. I mean, what the patient wants is to know that somebody will be the beneficiary of my disaster. That's what is gratifying about it. It's not, oh, we're so sorry we cut off the wrong leg. I want you to show me why you're not going to cut off wrong legs again in the future. There's a wonderful story of an 18-year-old guy who was texting while driving, because all 18-year-olds think they can text and drive at the same time perfectly safely, and he was responsible for a multi-car collision in which several people died. And he completely denied that he was responsible in any way until at his trial, the evidence that texting while driving is worse than being drunk, you're so distracted. He was so persuaded by the evidence that he realized that he was indeed responsible for this accident and took it upon himself to travel the country talking to other idiot 18-year-olds. He said, I don't want you to be me. Okay? Yeah. I mean, in that way, he was able to live with himself for this horrible accident that he'd caused.
And just to take issue with him.
What now?
I think that the initial sorry is actually important because it's an acknowledgement. Often in situations where people have been denying responsibility, saying, "Oh no, we didn't do anything wrong. It's an acknowledgement, that very first step, that actually we admit we did do something wrong, and that counts for something.
It counts for something. I agree, but that's my statement. Never just say sorry.
Yeah. Never just.
So if I said, "I'm terribly sorry, Chris, about ruining your entire life,"
which he has,
I have, yes, but here's 4 shirts to make up for it.
But one of them has coffee all over.
One of them's got coffee.
I don't want that.
The other 2 only cost me a tenner each. It's not a big thing. But what's really interesting, so if I sat down and somebody said, "Look, I know I've ruined your life with these accusations and so on," and I went, "Yeah, I know, okay, fine, and I'm terribly sorry." "Oh, okay, fine." And I say, "Right, so you've ruined my life, so I want your house." And they go, not so much. Then I'm sorry, but I don't think they're sorry. You know, I think that's just lip service to it. Ask for their house, especially if they're a Christian. They've got a house with loads of rooms; it'll be fine.
This also comes back to the larger cultural context and whether you are able to say sorry, because I imagine that in the UK it would be easier to say sorry for a medical negligence than it would be in the US, because the US is such a litigious society.
Yes, but the interesting thing is that when doctors say they're sorry, they are less likely to be sued. So there is, in fact, a national movement called the I'm Sorry Works, which is designed to get doctors and nurses and so forth to face up to these mistakes. It's really an interesting thing. That's why I was saying what patients want.
That's wonderful. Could we apply the same kind of project to politics? That would.
Let's.
Do any of you have any questions? All right, we have this big bouncy thing. Speak into the black one and then throw it to the next person.
I can't imagine this going wrong. This is going to be brilliant.
So let's have the first one is Anders.
Well, I should just say to his point about, can I have your house if you've ruined my life? I want your house. A therapist colleague who was working with this couple who the wife was extremely angry. The husband had had an affair, and so they were negotiating how they were going to get on with each other now that this affair had happened, and she was furious and blah, blah. And he was getting furious because she was so furious. He says, "Look, I've apologized, for crying out loud. How many times can I apologize? Every morning, noon, and night, I'm here. I want to be here. I want our marriage to continue. I can't keep apologizing every day. I'm getting really angry that you keep making me want to apologize all the time." So the therapist turned to the wife and said, "What would he have to do so that you wouldn't be so angry at him all the time?" So she said, "He'd have to do the dishes every night for the next 11 years. And he said, 11 years for one affair? But now they were in a calculation. So several things about this. One, they were committed to the marriage. It's going to go forward. Second, every time he did the dishes, he was apologizing to her. He was showing his commitment to wanting to end her anger and resolve the tension between them. And he didn't have to run around saying, I'm sorry. So it was a behavioral commitment, but a negotiated one. I don't know how many years they settled on.
Did they have to go back to the drawing board when they got a dishwasher?
What would be great is if he said, if I do the vacuuming well, can I have another affair? Suggesting.
Right, absolutely.
Think laterally.
First question, please. There we
It's
go.
all negotiation. Yeah, sorry.
Is this how it works?
Yeah,
Yay!
that's working.
All right.
So first of all, I do think that it would be very interesting to see a Sorry Works kind of campaign in the country where Brexit is still on. But yeah, moving forward. To what extent do you think education is to be blamed for our ways of thinking and our inability or us finding it difficult to admit that we were wrong? Because at school, a lot of children, when they make mistakes, they're just being told how silly they were for thinking so or doing that. And there are more and more campaigns popping up here and there saying that, encouraging people with lots of entrepreneurs from Richard Branson to Elon Musk saying that, yeah, you need to own up your own mistakes. You do not need to fear making any mistakes. So, to what extent is education to blame for that? That's my question. And if to a large extent, is there anything that we can do?
Yes.
Yes.
There we go.
Thank you, Carol.
Next question.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
I made the mistake of asking the wrong question. So what is it that we can do?
No,
Bloody idiot.
Come back.
Just say you're sorry. All right.
Yes, I want your house. Yeah.
I'll give you the science answer, and then the others will give you the funny one. How's that? Would that work? Right. Well, you've put your finger on something really crucial, which I didn't think was an issue here in the UK, frankly, but is in the United States, where many children learn mistakenly that a mistake means you're stupid. It doesn't mean you made a mistake. It means you're stupid. Now, under those circumstances, you will avoid mistakes. If you start making mistakes, you will give up the task that you're trying to learn. Whereas when children are taught that mistakes are what happens to you on your way to learning something, that you can't learn anything without making a mistake and without failing, then you don't see failure as a sign of anything about you or your ability. It's just what happens on your way to learning, which is a cultural phenomenon as well as something that is taught in families. Americans tend to have this individualistic and sort of even biologically reductionistic notion. You know, if I don't succeed at something, it's because I lack the ability and the persistence and the motivation and blah, 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 blah. So Carol Dweck has done some lovely, lovely research on this, because when children are praised for their effort at something as opposed to their intelligence or natural ability, if you praise children for effort, they keep going. They see mistakes as something they need to do to learn it. If you praise somebody for, you're such a natural math whiz, then when they don't feel that they're a natural math whiz, they give up maths. So in the way that adults talk to children, treat children, the expectations they teach them about what a mistake means, lies a continent. Two psychologists who went to Japan were really struck by watching the children in a Japanese classroom. One little boy at the blackboard working on an arithmetic problem, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. And nobody in the room was getting upset or agitated. Everyone was patient as he worked out the answer to this. The Americans were getting nervous and embarrassed for him till they realized in their own reaction that was the problem. This kid was doing fine. Took the time he needed.
I don't know very much about this area, but it doesn't stop me having an opinion. It's the same as pretty much everything else. I think that the problem at the moment in schools, the problem with science and maths and so on, is there's an answer. And so you have to try and find the answer, and you can either find it or you can't. You're either wrong or you're right. I think that most of the interesting work I'm involved in terms of kids and so on, is actually to do with the arts, where when you're trying to act or dance or create music, it's so implicit within that process that you'll make mistakes, because there's not one answer, there's several, and you're trying to find your way through the mess, as it were. So I think actually getting kids to do those sorts of activities, which have don't have mistakes imbued. It is a process of discovery. It's actually much healthier for them, would be my feeling. More arts, that's right. Less science, more arts.
Hey.
Yes.
More science, but proper science in the sense of, not presenting science as being about a set of right answers,
Yes.
about established knowledge, about this is what we know, but actually get a greater appreciation of the real process of science, with an emphasis on the fact that, that it's about kind of trying to falsify ideas, putting them to the test and so on. Having falsification is at the heart of science. And most, people who don't like science see it as just being this kind of collection of facts. And it's not. It's a process. And a greater appreciation of the nature of that process, I think, would go a long way towards helping critical thinking more generally. So, sorry, Richard.
Next question, gentleman in the front.
I was interested in the story about, the kid that caused the accident and then went round explaining to other people, don't be like me. How easy is it to influence audiences with a story like that might not concord with their mental image of themselves? I wouldn't do that. But we all know that the way you look at yourself and the way you actually act can be quite different. How effective are things like that, where people describe their experiences? Does it actually influence people in the audience?
And also, did you have a question at the back? Yes. Should we take a couple of questions at a time at the moment, because we're running short on time? Yep.
I wanted to ask about the replication crisis in psychology and how much it's affected this area. I can think of some effects that are still robust and some seem a bit dubious. So what's the norm? Out of those 188 effects, how many should we trust?
Okay, so whichever of those appeals.
I don't know that anyone has quite done the study that you describe. I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of the young man feeling the need to, atone might not be the right word, but to behave in some way, to try to communicate his message. And when he says to his audiences of kids, don't be me, the stupid guy, he's them. He's one of them. It's not some adult, saying, don't do that. So, but I don't know. I don't know that there's a study that's been done of this. The replication crisis, you'll be glad to know that cognitive dissonance theory has been amply replicated. For the last 62 years, there have been hundreds upon hundreds of studies in cognitive science and social psychology to both identify the biases that underlie it, but also the mechanism and the conditions under which it does or doesn't apply, how culture affects the expression and experience of dissonance. So the replication crisis is a very interesting subject because I think it's partly a result of a few things. There's been, because of publish and perish in universities and the need, you don't get to just spend time now, 2 years or 3 years doing some classic, original, interesting experiment that might fail and not be published. You have to publish something, and then you have to publish 4 versions of it. As Eliot says, you have to show that cognitive dissonance works on Tuesday as well as Saturday. Okay, so that pressure, the rise of IRBs, review boards that are very worried about, not offending participants in any experiments, which has resulted in the demise of the kinds of classic experiments in social psychology, obedience to authority, for example, means that research is more paper and pencil. What do you think about this? What would you do if that? If you ask somebody what would they do, they don't know what they would do, and what they think they would do is not what they would do. So what I'm saying is that there's been a proliferation of what we might call fads that are very hot, very cute ideas. Then Eliot worries about the TEDification of social psychology. Somebody goes on TED, does an adorable talk on this adorable new fad, gets a book contract, out they go, and suddenly here's this phenomenal thing. And then a few years down the line, people start saying, you know what? There's a lot of air in here. So the whole process of how social science has been practiced in the last decade or so has changed, which has created some of this crisis.
Do we have some questions from that side of the room as well? Did you want to say something, Richard?
Well, I did two quick things just to answer the points here. One is that, and Carol's right, there have been hundreds of studies. Oops. No, go on, give it a throw. Give it a throw. Oh, there we are. Not that hard.
That thing. What is that thing? Okay, go ahead.
So there's been hundreds of studies on the confirmation bias, and if you just look at the ones that are significant, then there's a very positive effect there. That's a joke. The other one, which is getting back to how you actually change people. So do a quick show of hands. Hands up if, in general, you think you describe yourself as a kind person. So hands up if you think you're a kind person. Okay, all right, so hands down. So here's the question. Last time you walked past a homeless person on the street, hands up if you put some money in their little pot or hat.
Did actually.
Okay, so far fewer people. And so for the rest of you, put your hands up to say you're kind people. There's the problem right there, and that's the dissonance you're experiencing right now. You thought you're a kind person. You don't behave in kind ways. Now, I know you're going to tell me that some of them are not proper beggars and it's not going to make any difference and all those things, but you're not a kind person. But you shouldn't worry about that, because actually I've done exactly that exercise for about the last 10 years in groups all over the world, and actually you lot score better than most. There are a few hands that went up for the thing. So in general, you're better than most. Okay. So to get back to your point, I have presented that exercise loads of times. I think you change people by doing precisely that. You get them to feel very anxious about themselves, and then you tell them they are not as bad as they thought they were. So the second bit about you're a good group isn't true. I always say it, because otherwise you've got this cliff and everyone goes, oh, now I hate myself. No, I don't like you as a speaker. No, I wish I hadn't turned up. Now I just want to go home. It was all right at home. They didn't tell me I was unkind and all those things. And so I think it's about, from a speaking point of view, getting that moment of people kind of going, and then relieving it as quickly as you can and just go, oh, no, I'm just joking, it's all right, fine. But you leave that hanging, and I think that's where real change happens in their minds for the time after that. Very similar to therapy, where you get someone to confront the issue and then move away so that you're not being confrontational and people hate the session.
Right, motivational interviewing is based on putting people explicitly in a state of dissonance.
Yeah.
You see yourself as having these values, but look, your behavior is not living up to those values. Of course, they might change their values,
Yes.
which is a risk.
My friend's a very experienced therapist, and I said to him the other day, I said, you've been doing this for like 50 years. What are you thinking most of the time in these sessions? And he said, about half the time I'm thinking, Christ, this is really all about you, isn't it?
Egocentric bias.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. I just love the idea. Anyway, sorry.
Did you want to say anything?
No,
We'll
it's
move
fine.
on to Can we have a couple of questions from that side? Yep.
Yeah, so before you asked about were there any cognitive biases which were beneficial, and I was wondering what you thought about the bias to disbelief, so not of, oh, this confirms what I already think and therefore I will accept it, but the part of your brain that says, this is slightly odd, I should look more at this, and I thought maybe you could say something about the tendency to question, actually, which is a bias to say this is weird. I should question it, and how that's useful for us.
Okay,
Chris,
and just
that's
one more
you.
question so we can... Yeah, okay.
Hi, what Chris said about changing your mind to new evidence or new opinion, should the ability to do that affect the way we initially, as skeptics and politicians and scientists, present the certainty of our original belief and the demands that we place on it?
Okay, we have about 5 minutes before we should clear the room, so perhaps we could combine the answers to those with a closing statement.
Chris, these are for you.
Right. So, I mean, in response to the second question first, I mean, I think yes, we should always admit. I prattle on about this, but I do think an important part of proper scepticism is to always admit that you might be wrong. You might believe what you believe now on the basis of what you see as the best available evidence, but new evidence might come along and make you change your mind. So, try and avoid being too dogmatic in your pronouncements, for all of us. Sorry, what was the first point again? Sorry, quick. This is an interesting one, because I think that we often think of the kind of like people who've got paranormal beliefs or magical thinking, they're weird people. No, they're not. You are the weird people. You're really weird because if we're arguing that, you know, we've got these predispositions more or less kind of hardwired in by evolution to some extent, so I don't want to overplay that, but, you know, there is an argument to be made there. What is it about people who actually question where their natural tendencies might take them to kind of accept particular claims and so on? And I think, you know, one of the areas that is definitely under-researched is the whole psychology of skepticism. I mean, because it's not a very natural way to think about things. And I mean, you might kind of find that it comes as second nature to you now, but, you know, what is it about you that makes you think in that fairly peculiar way? I think that'd be a really interesting question to focus on.
I think in terms of change, what doesn't help is calling people stupid and narrow-minded and all those sorts of words that we like to bandy around for other people, but not ourselves. So, and I see it on Twitter all the time. It's constant, on my Twitter stream, constant criticisms of Trump. And you kind of think, right, because calling his supporters, you know, stupid and ignorant and so on is just going to make the situation worse. So what you need to do is have sympathy and think, okay, so why do people think like that? What can I do about it? So you've got somebody who spent a fraction of the amount that Clinton spent on her campaign and won hands down. So what's that about? You've got clearly somebody at some level who's very, very effective. So the pushback that you're feeling in your heads now and thinking, I don't really want to think about that because I want to be anti-Trump like all my friends. It's much more comfortable. That's the feeling I think is a really interesting one, and that drives change, and it drives understanding of one another, because that feeling is how all his supporters feel when he sees the stuff that you write, assuming you're anti-Trump.
I really want to underscore that because I'd wanted to talk about that. It's actually part of the idea of listening to dissonant, disconfirming people in a group decision, listening to that point of view. It's really crucial to listen to the other side. And by the way, not to put them in a state of dissonance. You know, when you say to somebody, what were you thinking when you did that? What they're going to say, what I was thinking was that was a really smart thing to do. That's what I was thinking. And go forth. And, you know, it's because if you put someone else in a state of dissonance to argue with them, they will become more and more defensive and cling to their original belief even more tightly. That's not going to be persuasive. So this is really crucial. I was just reading in the, I think The Guardian the other day, a clergyman wrote a beautiful essay about why the poor in the community where he was, why they voted for Brexit, and you know what? And he did this with such warmth and understanding of the plight of these people that modern technology and the modern world have left behind. And we're doing the same thing in the United States too. There have been some gorgeous books about the white working class in the Midwest and the South, completely comparable to the situation here, for whom the world is passing them by, and they have really lost out. And so it's not just that they're stupid and uneducated and morons and blah, blah, blah. And that's not going to change anything, so bravo.